A businessman was traveling on a plane for the first time. He had always been terrified about the idea of flying, but his next appointment required him to do so. And the flight was going really well when all of a sudden the plane shuddered and the pilot came over the intercom and announced that the engines on the right side had stopped, so they were making an emergency landing. Shortly thereafter, there was another shudder, and the pilot announced that the other engines had stopped. Everyone was informed to assume the crash position with their head between their knees. For the first time in his life, the businessman felt extraordinarily vulnerable. He had never before felt the need to cry out to God, but at that moment, he did. God, he prayed, if you will allow me to survive this crash, I take a solemn vow to give to charity half of my possessions. Suddenly, all four engines began working again, and the plane glided smoothly into the runway, and the businessman rushed to disembark. As he made his way off of the runway, the woman who had been seated behind him, next to him, spoke to him. "Excuse me, sir, I overheard you, and I'm a pastor. I'm involved in several charities. I heard your vow to the Lord concerning your possessions, and I can guide you into keeping that vow by recommending some outstanding charities that have a lot of needs." And the businessman replied, "That won't be necessary. You see, I made a new vow with God. I vowed to God that if I ever got on a plane again, God could have it all." Sometimes the promises that people make are nothing more than lip service, aren't they? This morning, we're going to take a look at a promise and how it was fulfilled in the narrative of the search for a wife for Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, and why that's important for the church, even today. You may remember about 4 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook, announced that Facebook had surpassed 2 billion users, meaning that almost 1 in 4 people on this entire planet Earth are signed up on Facebook. And Zuckerberg went on to say that communities would be Facebook's new mission and that it would be the company's focus from now on. In fact, The Sun reported, Mark Zuckerberg has claimed Facebook is the new church, and the social network can take on the role that religion once did in giving people a sense of community. Friends, there are a lot of church leaders out there who are really afraid of that very thing happening and fear for the future of the church. And they ask questions such as, will our children remain members of the church? What about our grandchildren? Will the church still be in existence a century from now? And we need to remember then that the people of God in the Old Testament, they had many of those same fears. They often feared for its existence as a nation. And the story of God providing a bride for Isaac encouraged them to remember that God is faithful to God's covenant promises. So we discover that the story of Isaac is sort of a transition, a blip, if you will, on the timeline of Israel's history. It appears that the main function of the Isaac story of Israel seems to be that of reiterating the promise of God to Abraham that his descendants would be a blessing to the world. And that started, many of you might remember the story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, but a lamb was provided in Isaac's place so the descendant line could keep on going. But it was that the descendants of Abraham through Isaac would be a blessing to the world. And so his story shows how that continuity happens, that God isn't finished with creating God's project of creating a new people. And that promise is still valid for all of Abraham's descendants. And that was a really important storyline for the Israelites coming out of the Babylonian exile to see that God hadn't failed them, that God's promises would be revealed in time. And so it's at this point in the story that we actually see some contemporizing of this post-exile story. For instance, Nolan, thank you for reading that so beautifully. The Philistines are referred to in the Isaac story, but the Philistines weren't living in the area at the time of Isaac. But by the time of the exile, the Philistines had been longtime enemies of Israel and occupants of Canaan for centuries. So putting the Philistines in the Isaac story would be sort of like putting a Confederate soldier in the story of Braveheart. It doesn't fit historically, but it has a way of connecting the Israel of the exile with their past. And so we see that stories that are passed down, transformed to reflect current times, are an important part of finding and maintaining our identity even today. So what is it about this story that can be transformed and transferred that we maybe need to hear? Well, the story starts out by telling us that Abraham was a very old man. He was 140 years at a time, so that makes everybody in this room spring chickens, amen? I mean, he was 140 years old. His wife, Sarah, had just died, and I'm guessing that he sort of felt in his heart that it was about time for his 40-year-old son to get married. He didn't want him to marry any of the local girls who were Canaanites and did not worship the one true God. So Abraham calls his chief servant into the house, tells him that he wants him to go back to Abraham's homeland and find a suitable wife for his son among his relatives. And the servant took an oath or made a promise to Abraham to do so, that he would do whatever it was he wanted him to do. Now that promise, it might seem it was easy to keep, but there were some challenges facing the servant, because first it was about 700 miles from where they lived to Paddan Aram. And when you go by camel, you go maybe about 2 miles an hour. So that's a 30 to 40 day trip. I mean, Abraham's servant could have thrown up his hands and said, you know what, this really is impossible. Why don't you just settle for one of the nice neighboring girls and make this thing work? But he didn't, because he had taken a vow or an oath. He had made a promise, and after all, a promise is a promise. And he placed his hand under Abraham's thigh as he made this promise, which is a lot like shaking hands would be after making a business deal, or at least the way it used to be when a person's handshake was their bond. It seems that a handshake anymore doesn't mean that much when it comes to a promise, but it was a strong statement of promise for many centuries. And in telling the people about God's expectations of how they were to live, the Jewish people were told this in the 30th chapter of Numbers: a man who makes a vow to the Lord or makes a pledge under oath must never break it. He must do exactly what he said he would do. And Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, gives us this standard: just say a simple, yes, I will, or no, I won't. Jesus tells us that our word is our bond, that a promise is a promise. Because when our word is no longer our bond, it helps decimate our society and even destroy our churches. When the 19th century historian and social critic Thomas Carlyle wrote his 3-volume history of the French Revolution, he offered the observation that the revolution failed not because of the great errors of the higher echelons of power, but because ordinary people in minor posts of everyday responsibility stopped keeping their promises. We might think that right now we live in a world where many promises just aren't taken all that seriously. So it's refreshing to hear stories of promises kept and generations surviving because of it. And this reality of a kept promise is vital to understanding anything about God at all. Because without the essence of promise, God is some impersonal creator, but not someone to whom we humans can relate. Kept promises are a part of what makes God's character. It's been perhaps rightly said that the Bible is largely a record of humans breaking their promises and God keeping them. So life, as we know it, is grounded in promises. God's promises to humankind and our promises to each other. We make promises when we baptize a child. We make promises during confirmation. We make promises as a faith community when new members join our church. We make promises and covenants when we get married. We make promises as part of our work together. And history teaches us that when we don't keep our promises to one another, that's when cracks develop in the fabric of life. So William Willimon suggests that we in the North American church, which is increasingly being pushed to the margins of society and even disestablished, can hear the promises of God as Abraham and his servant both did. That God makes a way, even when it appears that there is no way. And he says that we in the church can remember the promises of God, God's relentless determination to make us a holy people, a light to the nations. And Willimon concludes by saying, our existence, our family of God, our church, our future, everything hinges upon the promises of God and God's faithfulness in keeping those promises. Are you convinced that the promises of God are real and vital for your life, for the future of the church, even when it seems stuck or muddied or different from what you hoped it would be? Here at Desert Skies, your leadership has promised to help you live out the vision of this church, to be a joyful community, drawing people to Christ through its mission to lead our neighbors to Christ, to love one another in caring community, to learn to follow Jesus, and to live a Christ-like life that serves the world. And all that your church council does, all that your staff does, is our promise to you and to our community that we stand for something important and something real. And we're entering into a season now of remembering who we are as a Desert Skies community, telling the stories of our past and our present, sharing our dreams for the future, seeing how we can live what is important to us in a new way for a new time. You see, we live and die with promise, just like Abraham. He saw the son born. He knew about the promises of his descendants being a blessing to the whole world, but he didn't live to see the promised nation that would come through Isaac. And yet that happened. And so too, God's promise lets us live in hope, maybe short of fulfillment, trusting that whatever comes, God's intent will succeed. This church will flourish because God has promised that it will. Amen.